So have you ever had this experience where the narcissistic person in your life now tries to spend time proving that they're not? Now, there are a few ways that narcissistic people may start to suspect that they're narcissistic. I mean, it could very well be that you or someone else literally called them out. You know, I never recommend it, but if you do, or if someone else does, it may send that narcissistic person down a rabbit hole. Believe it or not, some narcissistic people may come to it on their own. I mean, if you type in phrases like lack of empathy, entitled, and selfish into a search engine, narcissism is the word that's going to come back at you. And I have worked clinically with a lot of folks who, having worked with me, they didn't go and directly tell their partner or family member that they thought they were narcissistic. They learned that. But they did say like, oh my gosh, you have no empathy, or oh gosh, you're so selfish, or you're really entitled. So when that happened enough, the narcissistic person kind of ran with it and slowly patched that sort of hypothesis together for themselves. And finally, yes, there is a version of this where a narcissistic person does just come to it spontaneously, and maybe you don't know why the narcissistic person sort of suspected that you might think that they're narcissistic, or they themselves think of themselves as narcissistic. It could be that maybe they see a wacky lady's video on YouTube or on social media, or needless to say, there's a lot of people talking about narcissism right now. And remember, for all of a narcissistic person's propensity for manipulation and their meanness, and they're basically delusionally being cut off from reality, a lot of narcissistic folks are pretty smart. They can connect dots. Doesn't mean they're going to agree with it, but I'll tell you, this is where this gets interesting. Narcissistic people they need to be liked. Maybe the malignant narcissists, not so much. They're content just scaring people. But definitely all the rest of the narcissistic folks. And the word is out now that being narcissistic is generally not considered to be a good thing. But more than that is the issue of ego. Narcissistic people love to prove other people wrong. So they're going to prove to you that they're not narcissistic if they think you think they are, if you can follow that. Now, that may seem like it might be a good thing for you, and for a minute it might be. It could even feel like a hoover, depending on where you are in the relationship. This could look like them trying to do whatever empathy means to them, right? So they're now trying to seem empathic in this sort of labored and breaking a sweat kind of way, saying like, wow, well, that sounds like it must have been hard kind of thing, like it's a lot for them. Or they may offer you the first serving of something so as to not seem selfish. Or they may wait patiently in line so as to not seem entitled. And then they'll point these things out to you like, look, I don't have trouble waiting in a line. You don't see me complaining about it. Are you noticing? I've been asking about your feelings. I guess I have empathy, don't I? Or I said that you could have the last one, didn't I? That's not selfish, is it? It's sort of like one of those first grade classrooms where everything from the chalkboard to the desk to the pencils are labeled so the children can learn how to read, right? And this is where it gets even more interesting. Because folks, this whole I'm going to prove to you I'm not narcissistic thing, it's not sustainable. Listen, if the person's able to do this for years or indefinitely without so much of the pointing it out part, I'm not so certain they were narcissistic in the first place. But because they may do this performative I'm not narcissistic dance for a little while to prove you wrong, but then life happens and they will crack under the pressure of life happening, frustration, disappointment, and then that dysregulated anger is going to creep through, or the passive aggression, or the lack of empathy. And I know some of you are listening and thinking, well, none of us are perfect every day, Dr. RAMANI, right? No, we're absolutely not. You are right about that. But we may also, when we don't get it right, take responsibility and try to get it better or apologize. While a narcissistic person will blame the other person and take a position as a victim. There's a difference. The narcissistic people may even try and behave almost too good. And then will say, I've got it all figured out. I could practically be a meditation teacher. Or they may speak softly, like a new age cult leader, and call you the problem for being tightly wound and suggest that possibly you're the narcissistic one because you're not meditating, or you care so much about petty things like who will pick up the kids today while they're meditating and speaking like a new age cult leader. You may prefer the old days when at least all of their narcissism stuff made sense. But even when the day comes, and it will come, that they finally fall back into their old patterns, they still won't believe that that means that they are returning back to being a narcissistic person. This is where they will say that their capacity to play at being less selfish or less entitled or less angry or more empathic for a few weeks, that what they've done for the last few weeks, that proves that they're not narcissistic because they could do it. And they're going to take it a step further and say, hey, with the right person, obviously I can have empathy and be nicer. But you treat me terribly and you make me feel bad about myself, or whatever way they twist it, and say that you're the reason they get angry and that actually they're not narcissistic and that it's your fault that you bring out the worst in them. Right back where you started. So the challenge with the narcissistic person trying to prove to you that they are not narcissistic, though, is there's a risk it may confuse you. And since many people who are in a range of narcissistic relationships believe that they're not reading the relationship right, if the narcissistic person then rolls up and is doing non-narcissistic things for a minute to prove it to you, you're going to doubt yourself. You're going to say, well, oh gosh, okay, they are waiting in line and they are saying they're kind of aware that I think they're narcissistic, so maybe they are aware. And wait, Dr. RAMANI said the narcissistic people don't know they're narcissistic. And so now you start getting confused again. Ultimately, folks, the proof is in the behavior you witness. And a person who is not narcissistic is not going to have this sort of posted approach to life where they're pointing everything out and saying, look at this thing I did that's not narcissistic, and look at this thing I'm doing that's not narcissistic. Frankly, those things are going to be a natural part of their behavioral repertoire. They are going to be they are going to be empathic. They're not going to be pathologically selfish. They're not going to be deeply entitled. They're going to do good, pro-social, connected, healthy things. They're not going to give you the silent treatment when they don't get their way. Those things are just not going to happen. And there won't have been a history of that. But there's such a dire and desperate hope for so many of us who have been or are in narcissistic relationships that maybe there's something I can do to stem the tide, to turn this ship around, to make this better. And maybe you might think, well, maybe they're getting it because you want it to be different. People don't want to cut off from their families. People want to believe they can still have contact with their parents. People don't want to get divorces. People don't want to distance from friends. People don't want to quit jobs. So you keep doing it. And when they try to prove you wrong, if they do it for a long enough time, and listen, I've talked with folks who said, oh my gosh, my aunt has been trying to prove to me she's not narcissistic for 20 years. It's like a joke now. But when it's not that, and when this whole phenomenon is pretty new, that they're trying to prove this to you, and you get a little glimmer of what it could be, the risk is you start doubling down again and think you can keep being this way in the long term. As I said, if you're dealing with a unicorn, and this is a person who actually was not narcissistic and might have been going through something for a minute, and they've really changed their behavior permanently. From that point forth, you never see never see or really rarely see narcissistic behavior again. They're not doing this whole, look at this thing I did and look at that thing I did. But for most of the rest of us, when that person is trying to prove it, we might get a week or two, but even that week or two is pretty darn annoying because they're going to point out every non-narcissistic thing they claim to be doing, which, let's face it, is narcissistic. You can't win, and this one actually can feel like more of a setback in the relationship because it shows you that they kind of have a behavioral repertoire. They're just choosing not to use it. Thanks again.